Let's examine what the broadcasting channel Cartoon Network would bring us on December 30th in the year 2000. By this point in time, they saw a wave of stealth pilots for shows that have yet to even hit the channel. This was months before they would officially launch their adult-oriented block, now known as Adult Swim. One of these in particular was notable for kickstarting what would eventually become one of the block's biggest and longest running shows of its time. That series in question is Aqua Teen Hunger Force. We're in for a wild one.
My name is Shake Sula, the mic ruler, the old schooler. You want a trick? I'll bring it to you.
At face value, Aqua Teen Hunger Force is a show that's very difficult to explain, and that's because going into it, all logic and common sense is immediately tossed right out the window. It's literally a show where any day of the week, the writers would take these bizarre characters and put them into whatever scenario suits their fancy, and oddly enough, this became a working formula. Created by Dave Willis, who also worked on Squidbillies and Your Pretty Face is Going to Hell, and Matt Malero, who would eventually bring us 12-Ounce Mouse, Aqua Teen sees the everyday lives of 3 life-size fast food products: a large milkshake, a box of fries, and a big wad of hamburger meat. They usually get involved in some crazy antics, be it in their own personal lives or involving their next-door neighbor Carl, who really doesn't want anything to do with them whatsoever.
Okay, have a crappy weekend. Hope your house burns down.
At the very beginning, they tried to make this all work by setting up the Aqua Teens as crime-solving detectives, a premise that was only set in place because Cartoon Network at the time didn't want a show about talking fast food doing random things. Man, how times have changed. After about 3 or so episodes and the world of Aqua Teens was well established, this dynamic was ultimately dropped in favor of doing literally whatever they wanted, though there are subtle nods and references to the fact that they haven't lost sight of this concept entirely.
We're kinda not detectives anymore. I mean, that wasn't making us a whole lot of money.
Getting into our main cast, there's Master Shake, the self-proclaimed leader of the group who's pretty much just all talk. There are many ways you could describe this character. He's loud, he's crude, he spouts the most nonsensical stuff imaginable. He runs at the first sight of danger, loves to loaf around, and likes to torment and pick on his quote-unquote friends whenever possible.
Stay down, fool!
In short, Shake is a lazy asshole. Though what makes him really engaging at times are 2 major factors. First being that his mad ramblings are usually where his entertainment value comes from.
Do you know what time it is, huh? It's 2:30 in the afternoon and people are trying to sleep.
Second, and most importantly, the show usually has a really good track record of always putting him in his place, often by his own doing or by others around him.
I think that the branch will hold for... It's not holding!
Meatwad is essentially the little brother of the group. He's more cheerful and happy, naive, and curious about the world around him.
Look me up on Wikipedia. I want to see what I specialize in.
Shut the fuck up.
His recurring gimmick is that he can transform into almost any kind of shape, though realistically he can only pull off at least 1 or 2. He's often the target of Shake's bullying, and while it does make you feel bad for him time to time, he will fight back if the opportunity presents itself.
No, I need to leave!
Zone in target.
Got him.
So yeah, I think that balances out. Sort of. And that leaves Frylock. He's the real glue holding the team together and is often seen tinkering in the scientific arts.
What are you making?
A time machine.
That's dumb.
Well, Mr. Smarty Pants, have you ever gone back in time?
I've farted my way out of an elevator.
That's not the same thing.
Frylock's main source of power comes from his jewel, which hardly ever gets any attention beyond just being there. Whenever it is brought up, it's shown that Frylock can't really function without it, but that's really getting ahead of the game here. They all live next door to their sleazy neighbor Carl, who, which might I add, just might be the single best character in the entire series.
Yeah! Tonight!
Carl is just about what you'd expect in this kind of neighborhood. He'll often talk down to his neighbors or straight up ghost them wherever possible. He's got no real ambitions going for him aside from living a simple life, either lounging around or tinkering into his, adult interests. Gonna put it at that and leave it at that. What really makes Carl great is simply his performance. Almost any time he's on screen, Carl will usually say something so off the wall that you can't help but enjoy it.
This line here, line of death. You cross it, and your freedoms no longer exist. Okay? Have a good day.
That might have something to do with the legendary acting talents of Dave Willis himself. And note that this is the same guy who would voice a multitude of characters on this show, including our lovable Meatwad and one of the Mooninites, which segues into, well, pretty much every other character in the show. There are so many characters that popped up in the show that they would almost be impossible to list in one sitting, but I'll do what I can to go through the most notable ones. Typically, the show would follow a pseudo Monster of the Week format, where some bizarre rando would show up and antics would ensue. This was more prominent in the early days when they were still getting a feel for the show they're making, but to highlight a few, there's Moth Monster Man, this alien thing that controls its victims to talk properly, Shake's supposed son, quote unquote, these two frat aliens, a living mummy, a psychotic doll with tendencies to self-harm, a chicken-obsessed shaman, the friendliest piece of filth you will ever see in your life, this cool sick predator XP, and I think I'm just scratching the surface. The most notorious and infamous of these being Hand Banana, a dog made from Shake's DNA that, and I'm putting this as lightly as possible, wants to have his way with Carl.
Tonight, you.
I'm gonna let you put the pieces together as to why this would most likely be problematic now. The more iconic figures are definitely worth talking about. Enter the Moonanites.
I am Ignignoct and this is
I am
We are Moonanites from the inner core of the moon.
You said it right.
Are recurring villains of the lot that always seem to serve as a bad influence every time they encounter the Aqua Teens. From getting Miwon into trouble to getting them hooked on some sweet Mary Jane. They always have some sort of scheme or moronic scam at the ready.
So won't you please help us save our crabs?
Please stop fueling my silent rage.
These two are absolute legends. It would even be so famous that I'm positive a certain state won't be forgetting them anytime soon. But that's just another story on its own. Personally speaking, my favorites would have to be the next set of villains, the Plutonians. These two are just straight up priceless. They set themselves to appear as these high and mighty supervillains to be feared, but they're really just a bunch of idiots with no real foresight, or game plan for that matter.
World domination? You guys couldn't take over a damn bowl of jello.
Hey, is that like an important place or something?
They captured Shake on 2 different occasions, and none of them ever worked out in their favor. In short, they're great, and about on par with the Moonanites, and it's conflicting to say which I enjoy seeing more. Funny how they almost had their own series at one point. One thing you might have noticed is the show's animation style, or lack thereof. It's one of those shows that was made with little to no budget, about on par with Space Ghost Coast to Coast, and would soon be repeated in other series such as The Brack Show, Squidbillies, Perfect Hair Forever, and even 12-Ounce Mouse. Shows that you know were under their belt if you stuck with them long enough. This was more apparent in the show's early days, but as the series evolved, you can tell they never lost sight of this animation philosophy, even when they start pulling off more fancy effects and advanced CGI, and I'm bringing this up particularly because this style of animation wouldn't really last. In order to tell that story, I have to quickly bring up the fact that the show would go on to garner its own set of movies during its lifespan. 2007's movie film for theaters, which is more like watching an extended episode of the show itself, and 2022's Plantasm, which brings us back to the topic of animation. By the time Plantasm rolled out, the style shifted into what I'd only describe as flash-based animation. There's more smooth and fluid movement, there's more expression and dynamic cinematic angles. It's like a huge step in budget, and while I can see this working for a movie like this, they'd eventually carry it into the show itself. And the more I see this in motion, the harder it's really gotten to get used to. Subject for another video, I suppose. Honestly, my memories going into the show is what I really want to jump into. I wouldn't really get into it until the show's 7th season, and even when I've caught up and seen just about everything leading up to that point, it's still the weirdest thing I have ever seen. And I practically loved every minute of it. Not all of it was great, mind you. Seasons 5 and 6 were particular low points. But on the whole, I'm relieved that the show never really lost its touch, even when they started getting darker and graphic and mature themes. That is to say, the quality of the show stayed somewhat consistent throughout its runtime. And I guess it helps that the same writers were on board for the entirety of the show's run. It's something I really appreciate, even when the show went through all these name changes, which really means that they get a new theme song every year. Nothing much changes otherwise. Personally speaking, my favorite seasons are kinda hard to decide on, with over 100 episodes and 11 minutes to sort through. Specific highlights would go through the time they were invaded by a living remote control, when Carl had to go through an intervention. There was this awesome pinball machine in one episode that I seriously wish was official. How about that time Shake tried to off himself to torment Meatwad in a video game, only for Meatwad to move on from it, ultimately causing this scheme to backfire. That time they were infested with internet ads. One of my personal favorites being when Meatwad wins tickets to the Super Bowl and everyone's fighting to go with him. Or even the time Shake converts to a certain religion, which gave us this classic gem.
This is the Bible.
You question the words of the mighty Jimmy?
so many good moments to count. And if you're into crazy off-the-wall scenarios and can handle the more mature elements of the series, this might be worth your time. Because at the end of it, Aqua Teen Hunger Force is truly one of a kind, and we're unlikely to see another show like this for years to come. And who knows, I might go into every season in depth and see how well things hold up from there. That's gonna be for another time though. I really hope to get the chance. Thank you all so much for watching. This is Miss Dan signing out, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care, everybody.